Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I see some familiar faces. That's great, and welcome to the new faces. I'm very excited to introduce our two panelists today. It's going to be very, very interesting, I think. So, Howard Kaminsky, a research fellow at the Pardes Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution. He is also a mediator in my department, Community Mediation Services in Queens. Howard is going to talk about fundamentals of Jewish conflict resolution, a few key elements in that. So welcome, Howard.
Good afternoon. A pleasure to be here. Due to time constraints, this is going to have to be a shortened version of my paper. Okay. In 2017, Academic Studies Press published my book, which is entitled Fundamentals of Jewish Conflict Resolution, Traditional Jewish Perspectives on Resolving Interpersonal Conflicts. One reviewer, that was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was the former chief rabbi of the UK, described the book as a superb study informed by fastidious scholarship of the key principles of conflict resolution in Jewish law and thought. The way that I like to describe it, the book answers the question of how are you supposed to handle conflict in your life based upon traditional Jewish sources, and let me make this clear, without the involvement of any type of third party. That means to say, the focus of my book is not on Jewish mediation or arbitration, nor does it focus on intergroup conflict resolution. The focus, as the title indicates, is on the basic concepts for resolving interpersonal conflicts that are found in the Jewish tradition, most of which are certainly also applicable to intergroup conflicts and third-party interventions such as mediation and arbitration. However, the focus clearly is on how two people may possibly resolve their interpersonal issues on their own. Now, I worked over 8 years on this book, and it's a relatively lengthy work. It's 609 pages, and it's not exactly a light read. To be totally honest and upfront, even though I did my best to try to make the book as accessible as possible, even to lay people who may not have a background in Jewish studies, for someone who has no such background, there are some sections that they may find somewhat challenging. What I'd like to do today is to first present the methodology and approach that I employed in doing my research, and then I'd like to share with you just a few of what I personally consider to be some of the key elements that I discuss in my book. So we're going to start with an analytic comparative framework for comparing and contrasting the approaches of contemporary conflict resolution with traditional religious approaches. Throughout graduate school, I spent an enormous amount of time researching contemporary and traditional religious models of conflict resolution. As I was studying these models, I began to identify certain common denominators that they all seem to share. I found 5 very broad and basic components that are present in veritably all models of conflict resolution. Number 1, they all had certain fundamental underlying values on which they were based. For example, cooperation or the promotion of peaceful coexistence. 2, oops, I think I just lost it. Okay, there we go. 2, they were all based on certain fundamental underlying theoretical concepts about conflict. For example, the concept that there are both negative and positive aspects to conflict, or that as a general rule, you're not supposed to ignore conflict. 3, They all included certain practical behavioral guidelines and rules of conduct that the disputing parties should follow in the process of resolving their differences. For example, the guidelines and rules of collaborative negotiation. 4, they all asked the parties to engage in certain internal cognitive, that's thought-related processes. For example, that the parties engage in perspective taking or problem solving. 5, they all had an affective component. That is, they all at some point dealt with the constructive expression of emotions. The first two components, the underlying values and concepts, together serve as the foundation of any given model of conflict resolution. Components 3 through 5 constitute a model's applied behavioral, cognitive, and affective components. After identifying these 5 essential components, I proceeded with my research into the traditional Jewish perspective on these elements of conflict resolution. I believe that this approach of analyzing and categorizing models of conflict resolution based on fundamental values and concepts, behavioral, cognitive, and affective components may be equally valuable and applicable to other religious traditions as well. The following sections and material that I'll be presenting can serve as examples of how this approach may practically be applied in researching, organizing, and presenting any given model, religious or otherwise, of conflict resolution. So, let's first talk about foundational values and concepts of Jewish conflict resolution. The first category of elements I examine in my book are the foundational values of traditional Jewish conflict resolution. And I touch on a number of traditional values in the book, such as love for one's neighbor or one's fellow human being, character development, and kavod habriot, respect for people or human dignity. However, unquestionably, my primary focus is on the basic, fundamental, foundational value of pursuing peaceful or harmonious coexistence, what is known in Hebrew as redifat shalom, hashalom, pursuing peace. Based on numerous biblical, Talmudic, Midrashic teachings, the teachings of classic medieval and later rabbinic scholars, and building upon Rabbi Joseph D. Epstein's seminal analysis of the Jewish perspective on peace, which is found in his work entitled Mitzvot HaShalom, The Commandments on Peace, I explore the traditional Jewish perspective on peace. In my research, I found, among the many novel concepts regarding peace and conflict that Judaism has promulgated, that there exists a fundamental and sacred obligation to not only do one's utmost to resolve conflicts using peaceful means and avoiding all types of destructive conflict, but to also cultivate positive human relationships. This latter obligation, which Rabbi Epstein described as the principle of positive peace, requires that one not only try to attain a level of negative peace, namely the prevention of hatred, strife, aggression, and the like, but also requires that one try to strive to achieve, if at all possible, some type of positive peace, such as interconnectedness between people, feelings of friendship, fraternity, and when possible, even love. Next, let's talk about foundational concepts. There exists a multitude of traditional Jewish sources that deal with what may be categorized as foundational concepts of Jewish conflict resolution. One of these is clearly the early rabbinic text that is found in the chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, that discusses the concept of a dispute for the sake of heaven, which is one of the most well-known rabbinic sources that relates to conflict. In this Mishnah, which unfortunately we don't have time to explain and get into, the Jewish sages established a basic typology of conflicts that sets forth standards by which one may identify and classify a conflict as being either constructive or destructive. The concepts set forth in this Mishnah were subsequently expounded on by countless rabbinic scholars down through the ages. I therefore decided that I'd go through all of the major commentaries that discuss this text and search for reoccurring themes, exegetical motifs, that relate to this Mishnah and the concept of constructive and destructive conflict. I went through over 100 commentaries, and I found that according to many of the sources that I went through, among the basic prerequisites for achieving constructive conflict is the adherence to principles of intellectual integrity, or what the commentators often describe as seeking and establishing, quote unquote, the truth. These principles require such things as a diligent, objective, and honest analysis of the issues involved, engaging in dialogue with those who have different opinions, an open-mindedness to views that oppose one's own, and, of course, a willingness to retract one's opinion when called for. Let's talk about behavioral guidelines and rules of conduct for Jewish interpersonal conflict resolution. All models of conflict resolution contain certain behavioral guidelines and rules of conduct. The purpose of the guidelines and rules is to steer the disputing parties through the arduous process of resolving their issues in the most effective way possible, as perceived through the eyes of the formulators of the model and in consonance with the model's underlying values and theoretical concepts. In Judaism, there are manifold normative requirements, which are termed mitzvot, commandments, and halachot, laws, that directly relate to conflict and conflict resolution. So I started off by choosing 6 of Judaism's most basic obligations and prohibitions of interpersonal relations, which I believed played a pivotal role in the prevention of destructive conflict and serve major functions throughout the entire process of conflict resolution. And these include the commandments of you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, the prohibition against physical violence, and the prohibitions against verbal abuse, which enjoin an individual from cursing, embarrassing, or saying hurtful things to another person. For each one of these commandments, I present sources in the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, Midrashim, and later halachic sources, and I discuss, practically speaking, the basic obligations and the parameters of these 6 mitzvot, commandments. In the next section of the book, I focus on what I term the basic commandments and laws of interpersonal conflict resolution. The commandments... Okay. The commandments that I discuss include those that deal with retaliation and resentment, that is the biblical prohibitions against taking revenge and bearing a grudge. And I discuss at length, it's the largest chapter in the book, the halachic obligations and parameters of asking and granting forgiveness. What I personally consider to be the most basic and essential behavioral element of Jewish interpersonal conflict resolution, which I discuss in this section, and I describe this as the centerpiece of the paradigm that I present, is what is known in rabbinic parlance as tochacha, reproof for interpersonal offenses. Tochacha, reproof for interpersonal offenses, is the halachic requirement for one to respond to an interpersonal provocation or an interpersonal issue through respectful and sensitive communication. That is, for example, if somebody comes over and offends you or hurts you in some way, according to Jewish law, you're supposed to go over to that person who committed the offense and discuss with that person the issue, what had occurred, in a respectful and sensitive manner, and thereby try to resolve the issue. Okay? Two more sections. Cognitive and affective elements of Jewish conflict resolution. First, cognitive, the thought-related issues. In Jewish conflict resolution, there are a number of cognitive elements that play key roles in resolving conflicts. For example, there is the teaching of the sages that do not judge your friend until you are in his place. What I decided to focus on was the halachic obligation of judging a person towards the scale of merit. That is, giving a person the benefit of the doubt, judging people favorably. This concept, according to the Talmud, is derived from the verse in Leviticus, in righteousness you shall judge your friend. And I point out that a number of authors assert that the purpose of this mitzvah of judging people favorably is to counteract prejudices, distorted perceptions, and judgmental biases towards other people that contribute to conflict. We can't go into it because of time, but there are guidelines in Jewish law as to how you're supposed to judge a person based on the category of the actions, what took place, the personality and the character of the individual you're dealing with, and to objectively analyze them. Let's just end off one last topic, the affective elements. In the final chapter of my book, I discuss traditional Jewish approaches to anger management. Here we go, anger management. In traditional Jewish sources, there exists a wealth of material that discusses the destructive effects of anger and offers an array of strategies for controlling it. Over 100 years ago, there were two books that were published that discussed traditional Jewish approaches to anger management. One was entitled Orach HaPayim, the other one was entitled Amane Rach. Among the suggestions, the traditional suggestions for controlling anger that appear in these works are the following. One suggestion is that when it is necessary to respond to a provocation, I skipped one. I skipped two. If possible, one should make an effort to simply avoid people and situations that may lead one to lose his or her temper. One should focus on controlling or at least slowing down knee-jerk reactions to provocations. When it's necessary to respond to a provocation, a person should wait a period of time in which the anger being experienced may dissipate. One should put in the utmost effort when responding to an anger-eliciting situation to speak softly and with a gentle tone. A person should employ tochacha in dealing with anger. That is, you go over to the person, openly and respectfully discuss the issue. One should give the other person the benefit of the doubt and try to take the other person's perspective. The event, comment, or thought that triggered the person's anger should be placed into its proper perspective. For example, that with the passage of time, whatever's bothering you right now may come to seem very insignificant. And finally, provocations should be viewed as opportunities for personal growth. I just want to conclude by emphasizing that what I presented today just constitutes the most minuscule sampling of what traditional Jewish sources have to say regarding resolving conflict. Hopefully, it will stimulate some interest to do further research into what Judaism has to offer in this area and may serve as a model for doing similar types of research into what other religious traditions also have to offer. Thank you so much.